Good day to all you fellow mates and adventurers. My name is Mordecai, and welcome to the Institute of Supernatural Arcane Affairs. I will be your narrator for today, where we analyse various RPG-related stories for potential considerations that can be applied to tabletop role-playing. If someone were to tell me that Critical Role is one of the most influential Dungeons & Dragons streams on the internet, I would say that I understand that perspective. The wide variety of situations it portrays, along with at times fantastic plot beats, examples of situations, and broad approachability make Critical Role a source of inspiration for a number of tables. This is in addition to making tabletop role-playing have a more tangible effect on mainstream media, enabling newcomers to the hobby to more easily access it through sheer volume. However, this has had some drawbacks on the tabletop role-playing hobby. This brings us to the topic of the Mercer effect, where players and/or dungeon masters can take perhaps too much or even the wrong inspiration from Critical Role. There are a number of tropes that were popular before Critical Role came about as a popular Dungeons & Dragons stream, such as the carelessly raging barbarian, and now we often see a lot of discussions about how Critical Role inspired such player characters. Consequently, we should be wary of Critical Role's influence. But what about those situations in which a game decides to use Critical Role as the pinnacle example of what to avoid at all costs to the game itself? Let's find out as we embark on another delve. Before we begin with today's story, if you like my content or want to support the channel, feel free to subscribe and leave a like on the video. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. For now, please enjoy. Let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPGHorrorStories. Today's narrative is titled, "Nah, you can't do that. This isn't Critical Role," and is written by user Overlord Pedro. Hey folks, I've been thinking for a while about how to construct this, but we'll see how this goes. A few years ago, I joined a D&D community Discord with a rather interesting concept, where people would make a character, get it verified by an admin, and then you look out on the DM notice board, where you sign up and do your adventure with a bunch of people, and gradually level up your character over time. I have done a few adventures prior and have had a really good time, made some friends, and had a good few sessions. I was still very new to Dungeons & Dragons at the time, and I wasn't yet savvy with the local groups, etc, etc. This story took place just as my Dragonborn War Cleric hit the 2nd level, and me and a few of the players take up a job to investigate a goblin cave that is reported to be harassing a local village. The first thing I noticed about the Dungeon Master was that he was very short-tempered, and didn't have patience with the more new players, and tried to hurry the group along with decisions. Eventually, after a rather rushed introduction, we reached the Goblin Cave, which to our surprise was crudely fortified. So we all huddled up and tried to decide on how best to go about this. Our conversation went on for about 10 minutes before a voice cut in. "Right, I'm going to the store and will be listening in. If you all don't have a plan by the time we get back, I'll end this session and find another group who will." And on his word, the Dungeon Master muted himself. Needless to say, the tension and awkwardness we all felt was really bad. So under pressure, me and the new guys came up with a crude plan and thought, screw it. And here we go. Let's pause the story for a moment. So, something that irks me in a more immediate sense with regards to how this Dungeon Master was running this miniature adventure is the lack of established urgency in the situation. He's wanting his players to hurry up for some reason, but has presented a distinct puzzle in the form of a crude fortification that the players now need to figure out a plan in order to take care of the obstacle presented, and has now threatened to can the whole game because he is merely run out of patience. Let's resume the story and see how it pans out. As we mainly expected, it was a trap. Luckily, due to me having a shield as well as the other fighters and the speed of the monk, we managed to get through the trap. Eventually, we came upon this grand opening of the cave, where the goblins had this sort of altar, guarded by these weird beasts, and so combat ensued. We handled it pretty well. However, things turned a bit sour when I was one-on-one with one of these beasts. Those who know War Clerics, we have the ability War Priest, which lets us use, up to our Wisdom modifier, our bonus action as an extra attack. "How the heck are you doing that?" the Dungeon Master shouted. I calmly explained, though this didn't seem to pacify him, and he went as far to get an admin in the chat to confirm what I was saying. Following this, he asked the staff member to stay around to keep an eye on me. I shrugged it off, and we got to the end of the dungeon, where we begin to investigate the altar. At this point, an angel-like figure descended to face us, and told us to forgive the wrongdoings of others in order for us to be truly enlightened? What? With everyone confused, I decided to inquire and ask that, with my acolyte background and time spent in temples, would I know who this angel represented? His response was as follows. The Dungeon Master: "Buddy, this ain't Critical Role. I don't know what you mean." Myself: "I'm just trying to ask if, with my character's knowledge, after spending time in temples and such, would I know what deity they represent?" The Dungeon Master: "Look, you would have zero idea about this, so stop asking and just listen. This isn't Critical Role." That was it. I just sat quietly and let him finish his huge as all get out monologue about morals before the session ended. Usually you stay behind and offer comments for the Dungeon Masters, but I just left. I felt so put down by the encounter that I just left the server. Luckily, I never gave up with Dungeons & Dragons, and I have found far better people and have had far better experiences since. I am glad that I didn't give up, but holy moly, this was a real trial by fire. In summary, I joined a Dungeons & Dragons server, and I encountered a Dungeon Master with very little patience and a short fuse that belittled his players before I ended up leaving. And that's where the story ends. Whilst the story itself is on the shorter side, there's still a lot that we can unpack for discussion and consideration. Let's begin with talking about the Mercer effect, and more specifically about learning the wrong lessons from Critical Role. Broadly speaking, there's two versions of the Mercer effect. The first version is where the Dungeon Master and players deliberately compare their table to Critical Role, with the intention of mimicking that experience as closely as possible. Examples include having the Barbarian that's all rage only, with no significant backstory whatsoever, and insisting that the Bard be like Scanlan. The second version, which you hear about less often, but can be equally disastrous, is where you have the Dungeon Master, like the one in this story, or the players use Critical Role as an example of something to avoid taking inspiration from altogether, which for this story resulted in a poorly constructed adventure being ran by a debatably terrible Dungeon Master. And in both versions of the Mercer effect, there's no real serious consideration for the lessons that Critical Role can teach wordlessly about what a good tabletop role-playing experience can be like. My main point with talking about this is that if we use Critical Role as a source of carefully considered inspiration, that's mostly fine. But anytime a more direct comparison is made, it can drag down the entire experience for everyone involved. If we want to take this analysis to an extreme, we can argue that every scene or scenario in an adventure consists broadly of a setup, the premise, and the events that take place. These and other context clues can hint to the party what the intended pace and tone of the adventure is. Having visible prisoners outside the cave that are currently being interrogated by some of the goblins would establish that immediate action is needed, that the party needs to hurry and mount a desperate rescue. This isn't the case when you have a fortification with either a few or no visible guards. This tells the players that they should favour a patient, considerate approach as they investigate the goblin stronghold, which, when combined with the Dungeon Master's lack of patience and wanting to have the players rush, is a combination that many would argue would certainly lead to a disaster. I sincerely doubt that the Dungeon Master in the story had considered the pacing of the adventure. Plus, it is worth mentioning that using skills to get more information about a particular topic, such as making a religion check to identify which deity is being portrayed on an artwork, is a feature of the rules as written. It's not just something Critical Role invented. So, very odd choices were made by the Dungeon Master. Let's take a step back and consider an alternative setup for the adventure. The party of adventurers are told to investigate a cave of goblins that have been reported to be harassing some of the locals. The party is told where the cave is reported to be, and they head there. Bearing in mind the altar that the players may find with an encounter with the NPC that talks about morals, the party finds that the goblins have established a crudely made fortification. We see several goblins with pickaxes, hauling various excavated ores out of the cave, loading it into carts. We have a few goblins with crudely made crossbows, keeping an eye out in case of ambush by bandits. This situation likewise calls for the party to roleplay amongst themselves and discuss what they are seeing, before they act on the information they have gleaned. Depending on what the players decide to do, they could eavesdrop to learn that the goblins want to establish a trade route with the nearby settlements, or they could even introduce themselves to the goblins, potentially discussing with and maybe aiding the goblins in establishing their business. Perhaps the goblins could subcontract the party into investigating a mysterious temple they uncovered during their mining operations. In hindsight, one could argue that it makes sense for the Dungeon Master to insist that his game isn't Critical Role, because if the comparison was remotely valid, the adventure would have made sense when one really thinks about the actual context of the adventure. You know, that being what I can only assume was supposed to be a dungeon crawl leading to a DM power trip where they get to freely berate and belittle the players for following the adventure set out. So, my advice for avoiding this situation originates from the premise that led to the scenario. If we have a guild of adventurers set up like the server was, we can have a miniature session 0 for each adventure, outlining what the adventure is about and what's expected. Give the players a chance to learn if the Dungeon Master is a good fit for the party before they formally embark on the adventure. After all, we all play tabletop role-playing games for the purposes of having fun at the end of the day, and a lot of fun can be derived from having a fun experience. Plus, not all roleplay is indicative of Critical Role tendencies. It is something that a lot of tables engage in for the purposes of world building and getting the players invested. I will end this by saying that I am curious what happened to the Dungeon Master after the story went down, since an admin of the server was presumably present to see the DM have a complete meltdown and monologuing about something the adventure didn't have any real build up to. Feel free to leave a comment about your thoughts on this situation. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed my content and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe and give the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. And with that, I shall see you all next time.